Good morning and good evening. Before I begin, I want to thank Mateusz, Ella, and the University of Wrocław for inviting me to speak. I'm happy to be here and to share my research about Asian American youth literature, particularly in the context of immigration and the library. Just a note, I gave a similar lecture at Busan National University a few months ago, and so my slides, a lot of my slides have been translated into Korean by Aaron Park, and I thought I would leave that here for you, just in case there are any Korean readers and speakers. Hopefully it'll be helpful to you as well. So I'd like to introduce myself in a way that connects to the topic. I was born in Korea and identify as Korean American. My parents brought me to the United States when I was 4 months old and raised me in a suburb of Los Angeles, California, where there live many Asian Americans. Growing up, I was completely immersed in my Korean American culture and community. However, though I read folk tales my parents bought for me in Korea, I never saw reflections of myself as a Korean American girl in American children's books. As a child, I loved reading and went often to the library, and my parents bought every book I ever asked for. But none of those books reflected back to me the experiences of my own childhood. I majored in history at UCLA, and by luck, I took a class with an Asian American Studies professor. He introduced me to Asian American Studies, and there I first learned about novels written by and featuring Korean Americans. Ron Kim's Clay Walls and Chang-rae Lee's Native Speaker and Healy Lee's Still Life with Rice. My Korean modern history professor, Gyuk Shin, invited Healy Lee to visit our class. It was the first time I met a Korean American writer. Yet at this point, I did not even imagine that Korean Americans could write children's books too. In 2002, I was pursuing a master's degree in Asian American Studies when I learned that Linda Sue Park had won the John Newbery Medal for her historical novel, A Single Shard, and that same year, Anna had won the Michael Prince Award for her coming-of-age young adult novel, A Step from Heaven. These are both American awards, and the Newbery is given to the author of the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children, while the Prince is an award for excellence in young adult literature. In 2003, I met Linda Sue Park when she came to the Koreatown, Los Angeles Pio Pico Library. Also in 2003, we celebrated 100 years of systemic Korean immigration to the United States. The Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center in Washington, D.C. held a Korean American children's book event with Anna, Frances Park, and Ginger Park, so I got to meet them too. So it was in 2003, when I was 23 years old, when I was no longer a child, that I first met Korean American children's book writers. Almost 10 years later, in 2014, when my daughter was only a few months old, she met Linda Sue Park. She is now 10 years old and has shelves full of Asian American children's books. Her experiences as a reader are already very different from mine. And this is what I want for all children. And this is why I have devoted more than 20 years of study to this topic. It is my personal motivation for pursuing this professional work. So next, I will share the trajectory of Asian American youth literature in the context of our immigration patterns and lived experiences. American children's literature depicting the Asian diaspora has grown considerably over the past few decades. And here I should note that generally I include all parts of Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on, though today most of my examples are East Asian American and especially Korean American youth literature. The Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Education, the acronym is CCBC, noted that in 1994, only 65 of the 4,500 books they received for review were by or about Asian Americans. By 2002, they tracked 46 books by and 91 books about Asians. In 2023, they tracked 641 books by and 410 books about Asian Americans, and this is a significant increase. When I began studying Asian American youth literature 20 years ago, the books that existed were fairly predictable and lacked much imagination. They addressed topics such as immigration, learning English, Chinese New Year, and Japanese incarceration. Today, Asian American books for young readers are much more imaginative. They address and include so much more, such as transnationalism, queer love, fantasy, and of course, K-pop. And yet this history could have begun differently if not for the exclusionary legislation that severely limited Asian immigration to the United States. Both the Page Act and Chinese Exclusion Act restricted and shaped immigration. By preventing Asian laborers from family building, lawmakers hoped that Asian male laborers would not want to remain and build a life here. They also capitulated to white people's accusations that Chinese men were stealing their jobs. With the restrictive immigration quotas enacted by the 1924 Immigration Act, Asian migration to the United States virtually stopped. However, Puja Makijani argues that had the 1924 Immigration Act not been implemented and more Asians lived in the United States, it is possible that Asian American youth literature might have had a different trajectory. Makijani shares about Don Gopal Mukherjee, a South Asian Indian man who became a writer. The John Newbery Medal was established in 1922, and Mukherjee was the first Asian American to win it in 1928. More than 70 years later, in 2002, Linda Sue Park became only the second Asian American to win the Newbery Medal. But our history does not begin with our exclusion. Unlike common misconceptions that place Chinese or Japanese men as the first to migrate for labor to the United States, Filipinos, or Manila men as they were called, traced a route to California in 1587 because of the colonial relationship between Spain and the Philippines. By the 1700s, they had settlements in Louisiana, as did South Asians a century later. Geographically, Hawaii is situated almost equidistant between Asia and North America. With the US's illegal annexation of Hawaii in 1893, and with capitalism driving the expansion of sugar plantations on the Hawaiian Islands, plantation owners recruited more and more laborers from Asia. Some Koreans were among these early migrants, but it wasn't until January 13, 1903, that the first systematically organized group of Korean laborers arrived in Hawaii, and that is why we celebrate Korean American Day on January 13th every year in the United States. It's also important to note the role of American militarism in migration. The presence of the American military in Korea during and after the Korean War, and also the American War in Vietnam, and the violence enacted in those countries led to many Koreans and Vietnamese migrating through marriage, especially women, as well as through refugee, family reunification, and orphan adoption migrations. These conflicts and other subsequent conflicts brought more people seeking refuge. The arrival of Laotians, Cambodians, and Hmong people continues to diversify the Asian American population of the United States. Whatever their reason or method of migration, during the second half of the 20th century, more Asians were in the United States and more Asian Americans were writing. According to historian Erica Lee, the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act, quote, changed the course of Asian American and U.S. history, end quote, by lifting racist exclusionary quotas and thereby opening the door to millions of immigrants. There were some Asian Americans writing throughout the 20th century, but only after the 1965 Immigration Act did more Asian American writings emerge. In The Children of 1965 on Writing and Not Writing as an Asian American, Min Hyung Song addresses writings by Asian Americans who were born in or after the 1960s and are now, quote, part of the largest and most celebrated cohort of American writers of Asian ancestry ever to exist, end quote. Song's measure of celebrated is the many awards, such as the National Book Award, that Asian American writers have been winning in recent years. Though Song focuses on writings for adults, the idea of a celebrated cohort is applicable to writers for young readers. Asian American children's book writers and their artists have been writing and illustrating extraordinary books and winning significant awards, including the Newbery Medal, the Caldecott Medal, the National Book Award, and the Boston Globe Horn Book Award, and more. So let's go back in time again to trace the development of Asian American youth literature. It began as a trickle in the first half of the 20th century. Suisun Far's 1912 Tales of Chinese Children is the first Asian American story for young people because it is written by a person of Asian descent living and writing about living in the United States. Jade Snow Wong's 1950 semi-autobiographical Fifth Chinese Daughter was widely read in mid-century America. Critics say Wong translated Chinese culture for white readership. Similarly, folktales from Asian cultures, fiction and nonfiction children's books explaining or translating Asian cultures, countries, and peoples to non-Asian white American children dominated the landscape. For example, Francis Carpenter's Tales of a Korean Grandmother was published in 1947. Carpenter's father, Frank Carpenter, was a travel journalist who traveled often to Asia. and Francis accompanied Frank on his trip to Korea in 1908, just as Japan was colonizing Korea. After Korea was liberated in 1945, Korean Grandmother was published, and it includes really harsh statements criticizing Japan's occupation of Korea. While Asian folktale collections were common during the first half of the 20th century, they tended not to include such overtly political statements. So in this sense, Carpenter's book and perspective are outliers. In fact, many of the earlier children's materials featuring Asians and Asian Americans include stereotypes and derogatory perspectives. After the civil rights movement, and partly in response to an emerging education market facilitated by federal funding, there emerged more fictional and autobiographical stories by and about Asians and Asian Americans, so the proportion of folktales and nonfiction to fiction has become more balanced. As Rothio Davis and Dolores Emmanuel point out, as adults looking back on their childhood selves, they write their own story rather than letting others write them out of it. They write themselves into the landscape of American children's literature so the next generation can see themselves reflected in the books they read. This is an experience unavailable to them during their youth. Over the decades, Asian Americans have won significant awards, including the Children's Literature Legacy Award, multiple Newbery Medal and Newbery Honor Awards, multiple Caldecott Medal and Caldecott Honor Awards, Prince Awards, and National Book Awards. Significantly, in 2021, Tay Keller, a Korean American, won the Newbery Medal, and 2 Asian Americans won Newbery Honors, Erin Entrada Kelly and Christina Soontornvat. In June 2022, Jason Chin received the Caldecott Medal for the picture book Watercress, written by Andrea Wang, who also received a Newbery Honor for the same book. In 2005, after more than 30 years in children's book publishing, Lawrence Yep became the first Asian American to win the Children's Literature Legacy Award for his substantial and lasting contribution to children's literature. In 2022, Grace Lin became the second. We are indeed in a golden age of Asian American youth literature. And just as a side note, because it was the same year that Jason Chin won the Caldecott Medal, that meant that 2 of the 3 people who gave speeches at the Newbery Caldecott Legacy Banquet at the American Library Association conference in Washington, D.C. were Asian American. And so I took my daughter to this, to the conference and to the banquet so she could see and hear Grace Lin and Jason Chin give their acceptance speeches. So that said, in addition to the explosion of high-quality Asian American youth literature, we are also seeing more problematic and stereotypical publications too. In 1998, award-winning Black and queer writer Jacqueline Woodson wrote an article titled "Who Can Tell My Story" for the Hornbook magazine. She says, as publishers finally scurried to be part of the move to represent the myriad cultures once absent from mainstream literature, it is not without some skepticism that I peruse the masses of books written about people of color by white people. More than 20 years later, I agree. Publishers are still in a rush to produce more books, but they are being sloppy and allowing low-quality books from both white writers and writers of color, including Asians and Asian Americans who reproduce anti-Asian stereotypes in their books. Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas writes in The Dark Fantastic, the problem of the diversity gap extends far beyond the mere lack of representation of characters of color in children's publishing and media. Many diverse characters that actually do show up on the page are often problematic. She continues, this imagination gap is caused in part by the lack of diversity in childhood and teen life depicted in books, television, and film. When youth grow up without seeing diverse images and mirrors, windows, and doors of children's and young adult literature, they are confined to single stories about the world around them, and ultimately the development of their imaginations is affected, end quote. We have an imagination gap when it comes to Asian American youth literature, and this is a structural issue. Given that there are so many white people and so few Asian Americans in American publishing, it is not surprising that agents, editors, art directors, and others don't know how to identify anti-Asian stereotypes. At present, 72.5% of publishing employees and 82% of K-12 teachers and 87% of library workers in the United States identify as white. And it is likely that they do not have a background in Asian American critical theory or know how to identify anti-Asian stereotypes, and therefore also do not know how to effectively evaluate which Asian American children's books are most appropriate for their classrooms and libraries. So this brings me to APALA. I have long been a member of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association. APALA has provided me with safety and community in this majority white profession. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, I began working with 3 other APALA librarians to update Asian American children's book lists. We realized that there were now so many books that we could not list all the titles. We needed to be more selective, and we needed a rubric to guide this work. However, at the same time, anti-Asian American violence was escalating. This escalation was fueled in part by the former administration's use of words like Chinese virus and Kung flu, leading Asian Americans to rightly predict that we would become targets of harassment and hate crimes. This is not new, as Asian Americans have been scapegoated throughout history, such as when Chinese laborers were violently harassed and pushed out of jobs in the late 1800s, in the illegal incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, with the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982 during the anti-Japanese Detroit auto industry slump, and more recently in the post-9/11 anti-Muslim and Muslim ban environment. And we continue to grieve the lives of the 6 Asian American women and the 2 others who were shot and killed by a white man on March 16, 2021 in Atlanta, Georgia, and the many other hate crimes reported, as well as those not reported by the media. Sadly, the hate crimes continue, and Stop AAPI Hate has tracked over 11,000 instances between 2020 and 2022. Asian American youth also reported high instances of being bullied in school and experiencing poor mental health. And in general, Asian Americans reported higher instances of COVID and racism-related anxiety. This is the context in which the APALA librarians and I began our work in creating the APALA rubric to evaluate Asian American and Pacific Islander youth literature. Children's literature shapes early perceptions of what it means to be Asian. So now, more than ever, it is important to have this rubric so we can curate library collections that do not perpetuate harm, but rather gather, promote, and imagine a diversity of high-quality stories about Asian diasporic experiences. The APALA rubric is framed by Asian critical theory. While there are 7 tenets of Asian crit, we are most concerned with number 1, Asianization, or how Asian Americans are racialized. Number 3, reconstructive history, which is about building a collective Asian American narrative to transcend Asian American relative invisibility. And number 5, intersectionality, where Asian Americans are multidimensional characters. The APALA rubric is intended to function as a guide, not a checklist, and can be used to critically evaluate individual books as well as entire collections. The rubric is guided by the following. What impact does this book have on a child or teen reader's understanding of themselves and the world in which they live? More specifically, consider the effects on an Asian American young person's self-image. Consider the messages about Asian Americans that this book sends to non-Asian American readers. This next section is about using the rubric to evaluate Asian American youth literature. The APALA rubric applies to both publishing and librarianship, and for library work, it most certainly applies to collection development and selecting books for readers' advisory, programming, displays, and use in a classroom. All libraries conduct audits in order to evaluate what their collection is doing well and what it still needs. In the past 10 years or so, the profession has been calling these diversity audits. A diversity audit is when we examine a specific aspect of a collection to evaluate how well it is doing in terms of diversity. I assign diversity audits as the final project for all my youth literature courses. And over the years, my students have examined library collections for topics such as LGBTQ, Asian American, award-winning Black authored books, disability representations, and more. It is an incredibly rich experience and useful to libraries we partner with as well. In 1993, children's literature scholar Junko Yokota wrote, "The outlook for quality Asian American children's literature is better than it has been." 30 years later, we do seem to be on a positive trajectory with this explosion of Asian American children's books. But I now want to contrast this by using the APALA rubric to examine an issue that continues to trouble youth literature, representations of the Asian body. Asian bodies, or non-white bodies more broadly, have been a topic of fascination among white people for centuries. One of the main ways that Asian Americans are othered in children's literature is through the body. Common racist stereotypes include slanted eyes, yellow skin, and rice bowl haircuts. The persistence of these stereotypes, which too often serve as shorthand for Asianness in children's books, continues to orientalize and belittle our literature and, by extension, Asian Americans. The idea that Asian people have small eyes, often depicted as angled, slanted, or as mere lines, appeared alongside the idea that Asians are yellow. According to Michael Kivak in Becoming Yellow, A Short History of Racial Thinking, Europeans labeled those they encountered in Asian countries as yellow in opposition to the white people in the West. Kivak writes that in the 1600s, it had become necessary to ensure that Asians were safely distanced from a whiteness that only the West was allowed to embody, and a whiteness that was beginning to be defined at exactly the same time. Theories about skin color developed in tandem with so-called scientific research regarding cranial studies on head shape and brain size to prove that white Europeans were more intelligent and developed compared to the people inhabiting Africa and Asia. In the 16th century, people began to observe that some Asians had a slightly different eye shape, leading them to write that East Asians had little eyes, though the term of the so-called Mongolian eye would not come into use until the late 19th century. Kivak observes that European commentators considered the most distinguishing physical characteristic of the people of the Far East to be the shape of their eyes, and that they struggled to find the right words to explain the little or narrow or sunken eyes that people of the region were said to possess. They were also described as slanted and little pig's eyes. Kivak connects these racist ideas about Asian bodies to the threat of yellow peril. The idea of yellow peril has existed for centuries, but became more pronounced and was named in 1895 when Japan defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War, leading German Kaiser Wilhelm II to worry that the Japanese specifically and Asians more broadly were going to take over the world. He thus coined the term yellow peril and commissioned a painting titled Peoples of Europe, Defend Your Holiest Possessions. Images of yellow Asians with slitted and slanted eyes violently threatening the West had circulated in political cartoons earlier, helping to fuel the anti-Chinese sentiment that led to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. However, as media scholars Kent Ono and Vincent Pham warn, quote, yellow peril has not faded away into the depths of history. Rather, yellow peril has persisted throughout the 20th century and continues into the 21st. In the United Kingdom and United States, white actors playing Asian people painted their skin yellow and taped down their eyelids to imitate the so-called shape of Asian eyes. White people continued to mock Asian eyes in a variety of media. For example, when Miley Cyrus pulled her eyes back in this photo in the upper right. Ono and Pham ask, quote, why do non-Asian and non-Asian American children taunt Asians and Asian Americans by pulling their eyelids back, end quote. They have learned somewhere that Asian eyes are slitted, and so pulling their eyes back as an act of meanness and mockery makes them look Asian. The longevity and persistence of this racist symbol is because of what Ono and Pham call media constructions. Media constructions are created, produced, and manufactured, and then made intelligible because their repeated exposure reinforces the creator's intended meaning. Readers identify a character with slanted eyes as Asian because the idea was planted hundreds of years ago, so we have been repeatedly exposed to it. As Perry Nodelman writes, perception is dependent upon prior experience. All objects are most significantly meaningful in the context of the network of connotations we attach to them, not just personal associations and experience, but also cultural assumptions, end quote. Young readers bring contextual information to their understanding of images depicting Asians and Asian Americans, and these images circulate in the same ecosystem as do children's books. Nodelman also says pictures exist primarily so that they can assist in the telling of stories. Pictures communicate to the reader information that may not be in the text. For example, though the text may not indicate a character is Asian, an illustrator might communicate that the character is Asian by dressing them in traditional clothing, coloring their skin a little more brown or yellow, and giving them so-called slitted or slanted eyes. So we can use the Apollo rubric to talk about Dr. Seuss and the ways in which he depicted Asians. You might remember 3 years ago on March 2nd, or Read Across America Day, which used to be affiliated with Dr. Seuss because March 2nd is his birthday. Dr. Seuss Enterprises announced that it was ceasing publication of 6 books because they portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. Specifically, Seuss employed a number of egregious racist stereotypes to depict people of color, including Black and Asian people. Two of the books that ceased publication are If I Ran the Zoo and To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, which depict Asian people with stereotypical slanted eyes and associate Asians with the color yellow. The Zoo even includes the word slant in the text, describing the people as, quote, helpers who all wear their eyes at a slant, end quote. The depiction of the Chinese man in Mulberry Street was selectively revised, but came under fire again in 2017 when the Amazing World of Dr. Seuss Museum mounted a mural display that included this racist image without any commentary. Seuss's nephew claimed that he used shorthand, implying that he needed an accessible way for readers in the West to read the man as Chinese, who the nephew claimed came from a place that, quote, was as far from the US as you can get, end quote. This emphasizes his foreignness. Claire Hutchett Bishop and Kurt Wise's The Five Chinese Brothers is another early example of a beloved children's book with anti-Asian stereotypes, where all the Chinese characters have slanted eyes and also they all look the same. Rufio Davis and Dolores de Manuel write that Asian American children's literature is working in its own way to replace the stereotypical depictions of the Asians and Asian Americans that children know best, as in what used to pass for Asian American literature. However, in this particular area, we have a long way to go, and partly because we have so much to undo. The first picture is an 1880s political cartoon. The following three images are children's books, The Story of Ping, and To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, and The Five Chinese Brothers. The fifth image is Jean Luen Yang's outrageous caricature, Chinky, in the award-winning graphic novel American-Born Chinese. Let me be clear. Yang drew on the previous racist images to create Chinky. Min Hyung Song puts these two images side by side and writes that Chinky is, quote, the grotesque stereotype of the Chinese as racially alien that first appeared in the 19th century. That is, in following the racist visuals dominant in the late 19th and early 20th century, Jing Yang deliberately drew Chinky with yellow skin and only lines for his eyes. However, Yang told me that he wishes he drew Chinky as more monstrous. He said, every now and then someone says that Chinky is cute. I don't want people to think he's cute. He's supposed to be uncomfortable, horrifying. In a culture that has normalized slanted eyes, and in the absence of a wider understanding of the historical origins of how slanted eyes, yellow skin, etc., are tied to the racist history of Asian exclusion, how are readers to know that Chinky is not supposed to be read as cute? But those same racial markers persist in children's literature and media. In her discussion of Asian American picture books, scholar Joanne Yee invokes Robert Park's idea of a racial uniform, demonstrating how, quote, these racial uniforms, made up of East Asian stereotypes and essentialist markers in the majority of picture books, signified Asianness, end quote. Yee writes that in an overwhelming majority of the texts with protagonists having Asian racial identities, but not specific heritage affiliations, the Asianness of the character was evident in their illustrated depictions. Nearly all of the characters had black hair, brown eyes, frequently depicted as small, slanted, almond-shaped, or without eye creases, and pale skin. Asian American readers who know their eyes are not slanted may have a visceral reaction to seeing these images in their books. Perry Nodelman says, children obviously must know enough of their culture to understand the ways in which pictures represent it. When non-Asian American classmates taunt Asian Americans for their eye shape, they know it is out of meanness. Non-Asian American readers are repeatedly exposed to these racist images and are led to believe this is how Asians look. And they also learn to make fun of these so-called slanted eyes, sometimes manifesting in serious racial harassment. And now I will speak about transracial Korean adoption in youth literature. And here it is important to remind you that I am not an adopted Korean and that I am married to an adopted Korean, and I am researching an experience that is not my own. That said, I am pretty sure I've read almost every American children's book that features an adopted Korean character, as well as many that were published in Korea, at least through 2009. And there are very few children's books written by Korean adoptees. In my 2009 examination of over 50 stories from picture books through young adult novels and anthologies, I found that the majority of the stories were written by white women and 2/5 of them were written by white adoptive mothers. Non-adopted Korean Americans also wrote some books. The few books written by adoptees were self-published. By February 2024, my spreadsheet included over 90 books with little change in who is authoring the text and the types of stories they tell. In other words, for almost 70 years, from 1955 to 2024, the majority of Korean adoption stories were written by people who are not Korean adoptees. And the book contained clear patterns. Most stories affirm adoptive families, which is common for the picture book audience. But since the children it speaks about sometimes face rehoming and other traumatic events, these are realities that also need to be reflected. They also render birth mothers as powerless and invisible, and almost never mention a birth father or any other relative. The stories also gloss over mentions of racial isolation, racialized bullying, or grief around the loss of birth family, language, culture, and country. They use family photographs or mirrors that show the racial difference between a lone adopted character and the rest of the white family. And they present the adopted person in almost complete isolation from other adoptees and or a co-ethnic Korean American community. These stories tend to affirm adoptive families. They sanitize loss as love and position birth mothers as selfless and silent. As Sarah Doken Morgan reminds us in her new book, In Reunion, even adoptees who are in reunion, that is, those who have reconnected with their birth families, they face loss over and over again. So I teach my students to critically evaluate both individual books and entire bodies of literature. And that is also how we advise people to apply the Apollo rubric. The patterns we find tell us the kinds of stories that tend to dominate. They also tell us whose voices are absent and what kinds of stories we still need. Given that so many of the existing children's books tell the same happily ever after, my family is forever adoption story, there's an issue with whose stories and what kinds of adoption stories make it through publishers' gatekeepers. We don't yet have the balance of enough adoptee perspectives in youth literature publishing to serve as a counterpoint to the dominant white and white adoptive parent perspectives. Applying Dr. Viet Thanh Nguyen's theory of narrative plenitude and narrative scarcity, we are not yet in a place of narrative plenitude when it comes to adoption stories. We are still in a state of severe narrative scarcity. The real test of narrative plenitude for adoption stories is when so many adoptees have shared their stories that we won't care if another white adoptive mom publishes a book. But we are a long, long way off from narrative plenitude. Korean adoptee and adoption scholar Kimberly D. McKee notes in her new book, Adoption Fantasies, in all kinds of media, adoptees are being spoken for and represented in very particular and narrow ways. We need more children's books that go beyond affirmations of love and honestly address trauma and corruption in adoption. Adoption begins with loss. It exists literally because parents and their child are separated. We already give young readers books about really hard topics. We can also talk with them about the rupture of families and child trafficking. Korean adoptee Meredith Seungmi Buse says, "This utter lack of realistic representation confuses, saddens, and frankly infuriates me." She says instead that adoptee picture books written by adoptees could offer empowerment, inspiration, and peace, along with a new level of honesty and awareness to adopted people. In the graphic memoir, Palimpsest, Documents from a Korean Adoption, Korean-Swedish adoptee Lisa Urlim Sjöblom includes a scene where she is reading adoption-related picture books to her children, hoping they would help her explain our background. She writes, "I quickly realized these books are insufferable. The focus is always on adoptive parents. Maybe it's because everything is written by adoptive parents." The Apollo rubric encourages insider authorship. Specifically, I want to emphasize that while a white adoptive parent is adjacent to adoption, they do not have the lived experience of being a transracially adopted person in a majority white society. As well, research shows that Korean adoptees whose parents do not take seriously their concerns about racism or who get defensive and territorial when an adoptee raises questions about their birth family, their adoptive origins, or the possibility of starting a birth search, have stopped talking with them about those topics. So a white adoptive parent is often operating with limited knowledge. So we are seeing a lot of picture books that comfort and affirm white adoptive parents, while edgier stories are reserved for older readers, such as graphic memoirs Monstrous by Sarah Meyer and Palimpsest by Lisa Ulrich Sjoblom, and the graphic novel Made in Korea by Jeremy Holt. And I want to point out that even while Sarah Meyer's white adoptive father was one of her greatest sources of support, he could not shield her from the racism and bullying she encountered as a child.
Sarah, sorry, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. Did you hear me say I also want to share with you?
If you can
No.
repeat a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Hold on. Did you hear this part?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. I apologize. I don't know how that happened. I also want to share with you about When We Become Ours, a YA adoptee anthology edited by transracial adoptees Shannon Gibney and Nicole Chung. This is, we believe, the first anthology that is completely written and edited by transracially adopted persons. There exist other anthologies, but they include the voices of adoption professionals, adoptive parents, and other writers who are not themselves adopted. It's also important to remember that publishing is a market, and we live in a capitalist society, and that children 5 to 8 years old do not buy books. Adults buy books. For transracially adopted children, they're mostly white adoptive parents buy books. So in addition to collection development, the topics addressed in the Apollo rubric are widely applicable to other literary analysis, library programs, and services, as well as to classroom curriculum. Many library programs and classroom activities hinge on racist and problematic perspectives, such as using the passive voice to address racist acts instead of naming white supremacy for the social and systemic problem that it is. The rubric can help us identify and push back against stereotypes in all areas of our library work. In her canonical book, Asian American Literature, Elaine Kim writes, "Stereotypes of racial minorities are a record of prejudices. They are part of an attempt to justify various attitudes and practices. The function of stereotypes of Asians in Anglo-American literature has been to provide literary rituals through which myths of white racial supremacy might be continually reaffirmed to the everlasting detriment of the Asian." The presence of anti-Asian stereotypes in youth literature needs more excavation as we seek to understand how our children's books continue this tradition of prejudices that began centuries ago. We especially need this research as we consider how this dehumanization maintains white supremacy and the connections between how media stereotypes are amplified by former President Trump's racist comments connecting Asian people to the coronavirus. These literary rituals in children's books and our larger media culture justify various attitudes and practices that fuel racism against Asians and Asian Americans. This is why we made the Apollo rubric and why I assign diversity audits to my students, and why I hope you will also apply the rubric or create your own rubrics that are more specific to the social realities wherever you live and work. So I hope you found this interesting and illuminating. Thank you for your time and attention. I would love to take some questions. 감사합니다.
Thank you for this fantastic talk, Sarah. I think that we all learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure that there will be lots of questions. I would like to remind you that you can post your questions in the meeting chat, or you can just raise your little digital hands to make sure that there's order. So feel free to raise your little digital hands or just post your questions in the meeting chat. So it was a wonderful talk, really informative and beautifully structured. Okay, we have our very first question. Carrie Ann, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Yes, okay. It's lovely to hear you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Dahlen. It was really great. So as like an educator, I often refer to Debbie Reese's blog just to double check, good representation of Indigenous. children's literature. So do you see your rubrics and the research you're doing maybe being consolidated in some sort of blog or website that, we could refer to when we're not sure?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I've gotten this question so many times. And I also love that you mentioned Dr. Debbie Reese, because she is one of my mentors and dear friends. And if people don't know about her, her website, Dr. Debbie Reese, American Indians in Children's Literature. Sorry, there's going to be some typos here. But if you just Google that, then you will find her website, which is such a great resource for learning more about specific Indigenous nations and their issues and how they're represented in children's literature and other media. At present, there is not really a similar website or resource for Asian American youth literature. I want to point out Dr. Noreen Nassim Rodriguez, Sohyun An, and Esther June Kim's new book, Teaching Asian America in Elementary Classrooms, which I think is a really, really great resource, at least for the younger set of kids, on good children's books. Thank you, Mateusz, for posting the link. And it just came out last fall. And so it's a brand new book, and they do a really great job sharing children's books and how we can teach Asian American social studies through children's literature. There's also the Asian Author Alliance and Kibuka, Korean American children's books website that's created by Linda Sue Park. And if you go to my Padlet, which was linked on my slides, then you will have access to all of these resources there. I think using the rubric and having people sort of learn how to analyze children's books using the rubric is what we hope people will do. There's also the Teach modules hosted by the University of Illinois College of Ed, which will teach. Illinois was the first state in the country to mandate the inclusion of Asian American community history in K-12 public schools. And so my colleagues and I here at the university created a series of teaching modules that help K-12 educators, not just in Illinois. They're freely available to anybody who wants to take them all around the world, to learn more about the context, the geopolitical context and the sociopolitical context of Asian American history, our activism, everything, our politics. And so I hope that also can be a resource. But the short answer is that there is not yet a blog similar to Dr. Debbie Reese's blog, which she does with Dr. Jean Mendoza, that looks at books. The Apala continues to sort of curate a list of recommended children's books. The awards are another way to sort of filter through. And the Very Asian Foundation's May Book Project, which I work on with a bunch of my colleagues, is another sort of best of list that you can see, at least the book that rise to the top. But yeah, there's that rubric that came out of the Council of Interracial Books for Children in the 1960s and 1970s titled 10 Quick Ways to Analyze Children's Books for Racism and Sexism. And we use that as our inspiration for our rubric. But whenever I talk about it, I have to say that there is no quick, it's not quick. Learning about racism and unlearning our own biases and prejudices takes a lot of time because it's literally the air we breathe and the water we swim in. And so learning about Asian America and Pacific Islanders have an entirely different set of concerns, cultures, histories, sovereignty issues. Devoting ourselves to the study of these communities, I think, is really what's going to help us become better at evaluating the children's books that purport to represent them. Sorry for my long answer. I'm in library science, and so I just want to throw all these resources at people all the time.
Wonderful.
But thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question.
That's wonderful. Thank you for the question, Carrie-Ann, and Sarah, thank you for the answer. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say that Carrie-Ann asked my question because that was the question that I had. Yeah. So before I ask Ella to read the question, which is in the chat, I would like to ask a follow-up question. So Can you share some titles of picture books which you would recommend? Like books which you think that we as educators, as people specializing in children's literature and in American studies should teach?
Yeah. So the first book that comes to mind is A Different Pond, written by Bao Fi and illustrated by T. Bowie. And of course, I'm in my campus office and not my home office. If I was in my home office, I could just like unblur or take down my background and show you the books behind me. But this picture book, I think, is one of the most exquisite picture books that has ever been published. And it did win a Caldecott honor, and I believe the Charlotte Salato Award. I don't remember. It won a bunch of awards. But Bao Fi is a poet, and he had written this poem about going fishing with his dad in Minneapolis, where he grew up. And the reader learns that, for Minnesotans, going fishing is a sport. It's for leisure. But the reader learns that Bao and his dad go fishing because they need something to eat for dinner. They need to make sure that there's food on the table. And so it's not necessarily for leisure, right? It's for survival. And I think this book does a really good job of sort of showing that nuance and also the tender relationship between Bao and his father. And Bao's dad also shares about a different pond back in Vietnam where he and his brother used to go. But his brother went away because of the war and he never returned. And so it points to so many things about refugees, about socioeconomic status, about the war and memories of war. And the illustrations are just really, really gorgeous. And so that is one book that I would highly recommend that educators use to teach something about Asian America. There are so many different things that could be learned from it. While I'm thinking about it, I also want to say that there is a very valid criticism in just Asian American studies in general and Asian American children's lit broadly, that there is an overemphasis on East Asian Americans. That is very true. Chinese, Korean, and Japanese are overrepresented in our literature and media. And so to make sure that when you're using any set of books to teach about Asian America, that you're not doing only Korean American, Japanese American, and Chinese American, that you're also branching out to South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, like Darius the Great, Is Not Okay by Adib Khorram is a really, really phenomenal book where the protagonist, Darius, goes back to Iran to visit his family. So making sure that we're including all the different parts of Asia when we're teaching about Asian America. One book is not going to do it. Gosh, there are so many books. There are now a lot of books that sort of like are, like the Asian America A to Z kind of books. And some of them are more detailed and some of them are less detailed. And I really, really hope that somebody does a study on all of the books that are coming out. I can't because I consulted on one of them. And so that would be a conflict of interest. But I really hope that someone does a study of those books. You could even do it with your students using the rubric, looking to see whether there's colorism, the emphasis on East Asians as opposed to like South Asians and Southeast Asians. These are all things that young children, once we teach them about these issues, can analyze on their own and find it very empowering because they can then take what they learn and apply it to other bodies of literature. The diversity audit that I do in my classrooms are not just for grownups. Children can do those diversity audits as well. They can count in a biography collection how many are male and how many are female. That's a diversity audit. So I think involving children in those kinds of analyses is really important. Let's see. You asked. Okay, I think I went off a tangent there, but the question was like, what picture books can educators use in classrooms? Yeah, so yes. Again, like Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. An, and Dr. Kim's book, Teaching Asian American Elementary Classrooms, is going to be the greatest resource for people to do that. There's now a new book about Mamie Tape, who challenged segregation. Her Chinese American children were not allowed to attend public school. And so she challenged that. And I think that's a really important story to tell. I know there are more books forthcoming about that case as well. Yeah, there are a lot.
Thank
Rachita
you.
has a lot of great questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have two more questions in the meeting chat. So Ella, can you ask the first question? Can you read the first question?
Yes, of course. It's from the same person. I frequently find South Asian American middle grade or young adult authors construct South Asia in their fiction with a kind of blind spot that is rooted in nostalgia and partition stories of rapture and distorts representations of South Asia as it is, especially in fantasy, which blends visions of a Bollywoodized India and one that existed 60 years ago. Do you find something similar with Korean American insider authored fiction? How does Korea as a geopolitical space exist in their imagination, and how do they convey that to their readers?
That is a great question. So when I first started reading these books, they all seemed to sort of be this like very, I want to say they fulfilled the model minority stereotype. Like there had to be something like really heroic, or they worked so hard and they deserved everything they got. And so there are sort of these books that exist where we sort of have to prove our worth and our humanity. And a lot of the books about migration from Korea to the United States are also like this. And the thing is, like, Asian Americans, those who have been, quote, successful, are successful in part because we had to work harder to overcome racism. We didn't have, the privileges of whiteness and generational wealth and things like that to survive in the United States. And so there is some truth to some of the success that Asian Americans have achieved here in the United States. I think that historically that has been overrepresented in earlier versions of our stories. Lately, we are seeing much more socioeconomic diversity. We are seeing many more stories about failure, about children who are not like good children. And I think that's really important. I'm just going to scroll back up to see all of the question. I think it's actually kind of exciting when we see folklore and fantasy blended into our stories, because that's newer and I think very creative. And so that to me has been exciting for Korean American children's books, such as with like Tay Keller's When You Trap a Tiger, the way that she sort of weaves the figure of the tiger into the story has been really, really interesting. Let's see. And if I can promote my journal one more time, in our latest issue, Ji Hyun Hong, who just graduated with her PhD from the University of Georgia, she published an article in Riddle 6.2 about return migration to Korea. So K-pop stars from the US or other places who go to Korea to become like so Korean people in the diaspora who return to Korea to become a K-pop star, and sort of how like the dream of that is fractured, and it's not the return migration is not as amazing as one might think it is. I think for myself, sure, like I have this fantasy of Korea as being this like really wonderful place. I have memories of going to Korea as a child, and I still love going back to Korea. But boy, when I learned about like the geopolitical history and the ways that Korea treats women, Korea is still ranked really, really low on the gender equity scale in terms of wealthier nations. And especially with my study of adoption, learning about how Korea has treated unwed mothers, children, mixed race children, that really just shattered my vision of Korea as this like, as the wonderful place that I had remembered from my childhood. And so there are more things like that showing up now in Korean American children's books. There are also more representations of mental health and suicide ideation, or actual instances of suicide, as well as racism, like the racism that many people in my generation say our parents will make racist comments, and the conflicts of the intergenerational conflicts of what we believe and what our parents believe. A lot of that is showing up more and more in children's books, and that's been pretty exciting. I think I'm going off on a tangent again, so I'm gonna scroll down and look at her second question.
You're not.
Yeah.
Your answer is wonderful.
Okay. So I do have a solid. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'll ask Ella to read the other questions.
Okay. And I have an answer.
Because, yes, and then your answer, because yes, I agree that your answer has been very illuminating. So thank you for your wonderful answer, really, Sarah. I can listen to you for like hours. Yes, but I will ask Ella to read the other questions for our potential YouTube viewers who won't have access to the chat.
Okay, so the second question, is there a database cataloging all published Asian American literature divided into region? If there isn't, there should be one, maybe a multi-person project.
Okay, so I am putting into the chat, and I will say it out loud for the people on YouTube. APALA, the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, if you go to their resources section, there are book lists there, and they are divided into regions. And so I'm glad I have a solid answer to that, and I won't go off on a tangent anymore.
Thank you. There's another one, Ella. Am I right?
Yes, you're right, from Tomasz. Thank you for your lecture. You mentioned about stories about being adopted and how it could make the trauma. I want to know if you can see some additional patterns in American Asian youth literature, which are the stories of including whole humanity. If so, what type of stories they are? If not, why this type of picture books is specific?
Thomas, could I ask you to say a little bit more about what you mean? The stories of including whole humanity. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Or Mateusz and Ella, do you have an interpretation of that question?
I'm also trying to I'm trying to understand the humanity part.
Like universal patterns. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are, so this is what Rudine Sims Bishop in her book, Shadow and Substance, about African-American children's books between 1965 and 1980, she would call these melting pot stories, right? And like she has 3 categories, and this is actually really great. It's a really great way to think about children's books, because she was looking at representations of Black children in American children's books. And in her first category, like social conscience, there's sort of like these like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner kind of books where it's like, oh, a Black family is moving into a neighborhood. How do we deal with that? And then there's the melting pot books where it doesn't matter whether or not the character is Black. The story could have featured a brown character or a white character or an Asian character, but it just happened to be Black, and you could tell mostly just by the illustrations. And then the third category is the culturally conscious books, which tend to be more nuanced and more written more thoughtfully. But I think there's this like tension between universal stories and melting pot stories. And again, it's going back to Viet Thanh Nguyen's notion of narrative plenitude and narrative scarcity. We do need children's books showing Asian Americans doing everyday things, eating ice cream, eating pizza, going to a baseball game, those kinds of things. And we also need the stories that show them doing things that are specific to their cultures and communities, because those have been so erased in American culture. And so, you know, like the example I gave about Bao Phi and T. Bui's A Different Pond, lots of people go fishing, right? Especially in Minnesota where the story takes place. But and so there's sort of this access point that children can read this book, and they might see the universality of like going fishing together with your dad and all of everything that entailed. But then there's something more specific to it, right? The socioeconomic aspect, that time that it enables the dad and the son to have the conversation about the American war in Vietnam. And so I think there are a lot of stories where there are universal aspects where any child, any person can make a connection, and that there are aspects to the story that are going to be meaningful in a particular way to a child who sees reflections of themselves culturally in that story. So I hope, Thomas, that helps. I think if we were to have mostly melting pot stories, that would make everything shallow, and it wouldn't lead to a deeper understanding of Asian America. So there needs to be a balance, I think. Yeah. And I see that my friend Phoebe has a question.
Yes, that's exactly what I want to say. Phoebe, feel free to just unmute yourself and just ask your question.
Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
So first of all, congratulations. This is a really, really important lecture, and I'm really glad that I was able to attend it. Thank you for sharing the information with me. And secondly, just hearing your last answer, you kind of answered my question about the kind of representation of in the very popular sort of early middle grade children's series, the Boxcar Children. I don't know if you were aware of some of the earlier books in that series have an adopted Korean child cousin, Suli.
Yeah.
And so from what I was wondering if you were aware of that particular representation, and also, am I right in saying that it sounds to me like that would be a sort of a melting pot representation?
Yeah. Phoebe, I am so glad you're here, because I had not really read a lot of those stories when I was a kid, and that did not come up in my search. So now I have to go and change my Excel spreadsheet. So thank you for telling me. But I mean, generally, there are multiple representations of Korean adoption where the book hardly has anything to do with being adopted. And there are adoptees where they say adoption didn't really figure into my life. A lot of adult adoptees say that being adopted was not on my radar until I went to college and I was separate from my white family, or until I got married and until I had a child, because health issues and things like that. Because they're constantly filling out forms where they're not available, not available, not available. So there, again, it's similar with just in general, we need a balance of stories, right? We need some stories where the adoption doesn't really figure, and we need some stories where it does. And I would be skeptical if it never figures into someone's life, though, because adoptees report later that it actually does somewhat, and it was suppressed, right? Because it was a form of survival. When outsiders write about adoptees where the adoption doesn't figure much into the story, I think that is wishful thinking. They don't want race to matter. They don't want adoption to matter. It does. And if we follow adoptee writings, memoirs, poetry, adoptees on TikTok and X and Instagram, you should follow Shannon Gibney and Nicole Chung and Kimberly McKee, some of the scholars that I cited. If anyone who is interested in transracial adoption and adoptee voices should follow adoptees on social media. Sorry, Siri thinks that I'm talking to Siri. But yeah, because they have a lot to say about the way that they are represented and misrepresented and silenced in all kinds of media. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to go tell my graduate assistant to look up that series and all the books that feature that character.
It's going to be a mountain to climb, because there are maybe 200 books at this point.
God.
And she's not featured in all of them. In fact, I would say only in maybe some of not the original 10, which were written by Gertrude Chandler Warner, but in the actually I should qualify that. I'd have to go back and check. But I know it was still kind of in the earlier 30, 40, some in the first 50 books. But because they're a favorite with my kids, kids solving mysteries. Later on, she doesn't show up anymore. And I wonder if it has something to do with that kind of advocacy, or if she just doesn't But then again, I haven't read them all yet, so maybe she shows up in the future.
Yeah.
But I will say that it is, it is, as you say, it is not a, we only know she's adopted because they say our cousin Suli, who was adopted corrupted from Korea by our cousin Joe, and she's a side character, so we actually don't get much internally. But when she does show up, she's an active participant in the mystery solving. So in a sense, it's kind of like a benign, but as you said, it doesn't really feature much of her own kind of adoption experience. That being said, the characters in the Boxcar Children aren't not very deep in general, so it might just be perfect for that for that world.
I wonder if that's why I had not found it, because it's not described, right? In a lot of places. Because there are a lot of things that I found just by chance, you know, like just a passing line in a book, which I wouldn't have found unless I was reading that book for another reason. There's actually quite a few instances like that. So, and I count them all because it's still representation. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that we don't have time for more questions, but there's one question in the chat. So let me just read the one from the chat. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, dear Sarah. I'm so very inspired. And may I pose a question regarding the representation of otherness in children's books with Asian American characters? As you kindly mentioned and quoted Dr. Junko Yokota, who is our dear friend, by the way, and who loves Wrocław. So you can ask her about our city. So as you kindly mentioned and quoted Dr. Junko, said that the outlook for quality Asian American literature is better than it has been. May I know how you think the portrayal of the otherness of Asian Americans in terms of perhaps Asian bodies and Eastern versus Western cultural differences has better been tackled and represented in children's books over the past few decades? Thank you very much for considering my question and for your kind reply. Sending warm wishes from Taiwan, Kate.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for the question. Really quick. So she said that in 1993. And I said 30 years later, we do seem to be on a positive trajectory. And maybe I should have said here, like specifically in terms of quantity and also like the diversification and the variety of stories and the kinds of storytelling that we're seeing. However, with greater quantity also has I just feel like I'm seeing, specifically talking about the slanted eyes, I am seeing so many more slanted eyes than I did before. And I think it's because people use this as sort of like a lazy shorthand to indicate that a character is Asian. They know that Asian Americans buy books and read books. And so it's like it's capitalism, right? But this like even Asian Americans are creating children's books with slanted eyes because I think they don't know the history. And that is why I'm like so thankful for opportunities like this where I can share about it and hopefully it's going to reach the people who need to hear it. But because there are more books, there are more problems, and they're just the increasing visibility. So as I look around a bookstore, I see more and more children's books being published that have Asian faces with slanted eyes. So if you go into a bookstore and you see a book by Eva Chen called I Am Golden, that is an example. The award-winning book, Queen of Physics, incredibly important story about a Chinese woman who was the queen of physics. On the cover, she has slanted eyes. She's smiling, so it's appropriate for her facial expression, but there's such a burden to represent on the cover, right? And if you look through the story itself, the illustrator is clearly talented and can draw a variety of eye shapes. So why slanted eyes on the cover? So it's things like that I'm seeing a lot more of. And also like for the Eva Chen book, I Am Golden, if you like the eyes on the cover are a little bit slanted, but if you look through the pictures, there are even more egregiously slanted eyes throughout the illustrations. And I find that to be deeply problematic and especially ironic in a picture book that is supposed to be like celebratory about Asian Americans. And Eva Chen writes in the author's note that she was bullied for her eye shape when she was little. So I find that one to be really ironic and very interesting. And it's also like on display in a lot of bookstores and libraries. So Yeah, but anyway, I hope all of you take away from this, like every time you see an Asian character in some kind of media, be like, oh, those eyes are a little bit too slanted for my comfort. Like I've trained my daughter to do that. She'll like run into my bedroom with a children's book and be like, oh ma, look at these eyes, look at these eyes. I don't like them. But yeah, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And now all of you here, 60 people, are responsible for analyzing this aspect of children's literature.
Thank you so much for educating us. Really, I think that you have done a wonderful job. So we have educated us and also our future viewers on YouTube.